Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're listening to the Just Thinking Show, brought to you by the Islamic Vibes podcast, and I'm your host, Majid. The Islamic Vibes podcast is available on all popular podcast platforms and on my Path to Revival YouTube channel. And if you do find this content beneficial, then please share it with your family and friends. And it goes without saying, please don't forget to subscribe and follow the Islamic Vibes podcast. Okay, inshallah ta'ala, on to today's show. Today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Rash and JK. Assalamu alaikum, brothers.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So today, guys, we've got a jam-packed episode, shall I say. There's stuff which has been happening in the last couple of weeks, which, as you know, this show is called Just Thinking. So it's those things which, as Muslims, we need to reflect upon, probably apply a bit more thought. So today's topic I want to discuss with you guys is about terrorism. Okay. Now we've seen in the last few days many people killed and injured by attacks that are labeled as acts of terror, terrorism. And more importantly, these acts are called Islamic terrorism, right? So we recently saw the attacks on the mosques in Afghanistan, in Kunduz, in Kandahar, which killed loads of people and injured even more people. It was really, really horrific what happened in these two masjids, right? And that was on days of Jummah as well, and people just going to pray the Salah. So it was really madness. And then we also, a bit closer to home, we had the murder of MP Sir David Amos, who was killed allegedly by a 25-year-old Muslim man called Ali Harbi Ali. And he's actually being currently held at this moment in time under the Terrorism Act. So as we know, right, we've done stuff like this before on podcasts. The way the news channels report these stories, it links Islam with terrorism and terrorists being Muslims, right? And it's no wonder that sometimes we hear, or you guys might have heard that famous saying, which, people try to be clever, but it's actually a dumb saying, which is not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Okay. So this is the kind of backdrop for today's discussion, inshallah ta'ala. And the questions that I want to sort of tackle, brothers, are things like, what is Islamic terrorism, right? Is there such a thing as Islamic terrorism? Also, is it true that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims? But before we tackle these questions head on, inshallah, I think it's a good idea if we explain certain things which will help the listeners join the dots, inshallah ta'ala. So my first question, guys, that I want us to discuss is, we're talking about terrorism, right? So what is terrorism? What is the definition of terrorism?
According to Oxford Dictionary, they define it as the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to inculcate fear. Terrorism is intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological. So this is how they define terrorism, right? So the key things really to take from this definition is that there's an explicit mention of political, religious, or an ideological agenda that the violence is linked to. So that means really that if someone was to commit an act of violence that creates terror, but it's not for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, then they won't consider that to be terrorism, right? So that in itself has already limited the use of the word terrorism to something that really promotes or pushes a apparent political agenda. And that's why you get all this debate and discussion about how some events are not called terrorism, but when a Muslim is involved, then straight away terrorism, because they've attached to this that because it's a Muslim, it must be for the pushing of the agenda of Islamism, you could call it. So that's one thing to bear in mind in terms of the definition. But also the other thing is the fact that even their own definition, there's an inconsistent use of it, right? So when it comes to a state or government carrying out an act of violence that creates fear in society, they don't term that terrorism. Rather, they term it foreign policy, collateral damage, something that had to be done, a kind of a byproduct of war, they could call it, or a drone strike. So, for example, you had recently the US did a drone strike in Afghanistan. They admitted to killing 10 innocent people who they thought were, terrorists. But their answer to that was, look, we had intelligence that this was linked to ISIS-K, and our target was based on that intelligence, which turned out to be untrue. But never has the media ever called that an act of terror. They've just called it an act which was unfortunate that happened. And that's just one example. But the point I'm making here is that even their definition of terrorism is used selectively. So, and that's why you find that when a Muslim carries out an attack, or so-called Muslim, whoever it may be, when they label it a Muslim carrying out an attack, then they will call this terrorism. The other thing to note is that when you look at the definition of a terrorist, it's defined as a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. So again, it's linked to political aims, right? But the other thing to note here is that they've reduced the terrorist to an individual. They've reduced it to a person. So now it means that you can't label a state to be a terrorist or a government to be a terrorist, because they've limited it to an individual, right? Or a group of individuals. So that again really shows that how this word and term, terrorist or terrorism, is used selectively to promote their agenda against Islam. So yeah, even in the definition itself, it tells you a lot about how this term is used for pushing of their agenda.
Yeah, no, definitely. Rash, anything you want to add to that, bro?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The thing is, like you say, these kind of terms often, like you say, get defined by the government of a country. It's not necessarily, I know like you read an Oxford Dictionary type of definition, but like what you sometimes see is like a CIA definition or a, American government definition and things like that. And those things are always, they have their own agenda behind them. So one of the examples I read was that it had the word unlawful at the beginning. So it's like an unlawful violence against civilians, but again, with, like you mentioned, political aims. The bit that stood out for me, though, the political aim bit is obvious, and you made the good point there. But the other bit that stood out for me is the fact that it's unlawful. All of a sudden, that means things like, going out and on war, fighting other countries, occupation, and all the stuff we've seen many of these Western nations and other nations go out and do with their militaries. They then don't fall into this category anymore because they're deemed as more lawful. Because if your army is going out and carrying out an attack, that's more of a, you're defending your sovereignty, or maybe America, as they think they're the world's policemen, they go out and defend human rights and these things. So all of a sudden, those fall into, for them at least, more of a lawful, and therefore terrorism doesn't get applied to them. But to be fair, I think anybody who really looks into it will realize that if they're going to really use this word and use terror as part of it, then anything that creates terror, if we were going to generalize this word and not use like the Western kind of definition of it, we would say that when you create terror amongst people, that's terrorism. And actually, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but the question will arise, who creates the most terror amongst people? And we can answer that, can't we?
Yeah, no, some good points. And also a good thing that you mentioned there, Rash, about the unlawful thing, because like JK said, these guys make it up as they go. Because if you think about it, even the Iraq war, where it didn't go via the UN, which is their sort of like, their system and their procedure, right? And many people call it the unlawful law, the unlawful war in Iraq and so on, right?
The illegal war.
The illegal war, WMDs, right? I mean, if it's illegal, it's definitely unlawful, isn't it? Right?
Exactly. Then all of a sudden, shouldn't that be terrorism?
You know, and terrorism which killed millions and millions. I mean, I think 4 million people have been affected from that, whether killed or or they've been made refugees. But that's actually, it makes you think that really it is them. And it's a good point that what Rash is saying is one thing we've got the definition, which is in the dictionary or what these states actually set. But in reality, if you're talking about terror, that which strikes terror in people, then surely whether it's lawful, unlawful, political or not political, is terror, right? But it's made up. So that's why a question I want to ask, and I think is worth asking really, because in the I think it was the 80s, you had the war on drugs, yeah, and against the cartels and stuff like. Even though we know that the FBI and the CIA, if you watch Narcos and stuff like, not that I watch it, but they were heavily involved, right? But when you talk about the war on terror, the war on terrorism, right? Does that statement even make sense? The war on terror. What do you guys think? Does it even make sense?
No, in a way, I know what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that they're trying to stop it. If you have a war on something, war on drugs, it's the idea that you're trying to stop that thing. But there's irony attached to this, isn't it? Because you just mentioned a few things like drugs, like terror and stuff. But actually, all of those have all had political agendas to themselves. Like you said, the drugs wasn't something that they were trying to stop. In fact, it was something that was facilitating their own goals. The war on terror is an even better example, because we see that there is no war on terror. There is a war on an ideology which goes against their ideology. That's what the war is against. The war is against Islam, because what they see is that, if we call it terror, then people will oppose it, and we can then clamp down on it. So it's always about clamping down, but there's always an ulterior motive. And I think that's the key thing. And I think this is why personally I don't like using the word terror and terrorism, because these terms are loaded based on whatever the political powers be. I'll give you another quick example. The word radicalization is linked to this whole terror subject, the terrorism subject. They talk about anybody who's been radicalized is someone that, potentially can become a terrorist. But again, what does radicalization mean? In their dictionary, they often term, something good can be radical. In a business, in work, they'll say if someone comes up with a radical idea, which is game changing, they see it as positive. So radical and radicalization can be positive, but they framed it in such a way that, just like terrorism, radicalization can only be Muslims, only be someone holding an opposing worldview. And that's why all of these war on whatever, it's them trying to promote their political agenda. And again, that this definition, political aims, isn't that their political aim? Or those people who have defined terrorism and radicalization, their political aim is to oppose something, and they're actually doing it with terror. They're the ones that, dropped depleted uranium in Iraq. They're the ones that allow the IDF to continue to kill and shoot and, occupy our brothers and sisters in Palestine. All of these human rights resolutions, or whatever, Geneva conventions that they broke. Who are the biggest people who commit terror? But why is there no sanctions upon them? Yet this one person, whoever it is, and often is someone, we can't even guarantee they're a Muslim, all of a sudden runs into a church or whatever and stabs someone, and suddenly that guy represents Islam. That guy who often is a drinking, non-practicing, random person that not random usually, someone the police knew, suddenly turns up somewhere, stabs someone, shoots someone. All of a sudden that person represents all of Islam. It's bogus. And anybody who looks beyond the media narrative surely should see that.
Yeah. JK, you're on, smart. JK, I think you're mute, bro. No, I can't hear you. Can't hear you. Let me just add to that point, and then inshallah you just jump back in, yeah, and sort it out and speak if you need to. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, just on that one, Rash, I was checking out some reports by journals, right? And there was one basically on journalists, and basically what they were saying is there's a quote here. It says in recent years, the increasing number of Islamist terror attacks in Western societies has led to intensive terrorism news coverage. The news media frequently reports about terrorist attacks. For example, the attacks in Barcelona, Berlin, Brussels, Orlando, or Paris, which have been realized by Islamist terrorists who self identified as Muslims. In this regard, current research shows that the news media frequently associates Muslims and Islam with negative concepts such as aggression and violence. Effect studies reveal that repeatedly pairing Islam and Muslims as a group with specific negative attributes such as violence or even terrorism significantly and negatively affects news consumers' attitudes towards the particular outgroup, i.e., Muslims in general. JK, you back, bro?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you, bro.
So yeah, all I was going to say is just agree with the points you guys just made with the fact that this whole term war on terror is very loaded and politically motivated. So if you think about the context, and I'm not going to go to the detail because I think you guys did a podcast where you covered this, but the context of the war on terror was that it came on the back of 9/11, right? After 9/11, Bush launched the war on terror. And there's a couple of things really to take from this is that was at a time where people felt unsafe and felt like they were at risk of being, terrorized. They were being terrorized as a nation, as the West. The whole world came behind America and they felt terrorized. So this in itself created a pretext because you created fear in the minds of people. So this has now created a great pretext for America and the West to do whatever they wanted. As in any policy, any foreign policy, anything would go easily through because people were at that vulnerable place where they wanted revenge, really, and they were willing to go to war.
That's good.
So the war on terror was born from that. And the key bit for me, and I agree with what Rash said, that we shouldn't feel like we shouldn't feel like we should be forced to use their terminology, because their terminology has been used for a certain purpose. Yes, there may be a linguistic, terror. We know what terror is linguistically, but the way they use it has a very, very, selective purpose. So when we talk about terrorism, it means something. So we need to know that. We need to understand that, right? So the other bit that just to kind of link to that is, I feel, I've said this quite often, is that the West need terrorism. The West, they need terrorism. It might sound a bit strange, but terrorism creates that pretext for them, creates that reason for them to do lots of things. And have you guys ever heard the term an inconvenient truth?
Yeah.
No.
What that means, and they based a film around it on global warming being an inconvenient truth. But what it really means, the phrase is that the truth can be inconvenient, that sometimes it's better to have ignorance, and kind of ignorance is bliss, right? So the truth can be inconvenient because if something that's true that you didn't know about, you have to change, right? What I believe terrorism is the opposite. It's a convenient lie, which means that it's a lie. It's exaggerated, it's pushed, it's sometimes even allowed or perpetrated by agents to push a lie of Islam being linked to terrorism, right? So they'll allow, exaggerate acts of terrorism in order to achieve their political ambitions. And for me, there's three broad things that terrorism achieves for them. Firstly, it pushes a certain narrative. It pushes the idea that Islam is linked to terrorism, it's linked to violence, right? And another term that people use, a phrase, is that if you repeat a lie enough, if you repeat the same lie enough, it creates the illusion of truth. People start to believe it, right? And this is for both non-Muslims because non-Muslims now have this perception that Islam is violent, Islam is backwards, Islam is about terror, because they don't know any better. They've got their knowledge from the media. So they have this view of Islam now, right? And they won't open their hearts to Islam because they have this view, right? Perception. And it also, probably more dangerously, impacts Muslims because it creates the apologist mentality. It creates this loss of confidence, this need to defend Islam, this need to say, oh, we're not violent, we don't believe in this, which often also leads, we don't believe in violence and terrorism, obviously not. But what happens is we then push their view of terrorism. So then we start to redefine Islamic terms such as jihad as not being anything linked to war. It's all personal struggle. Right?
Well, Jacob, just ask your question whilst on what you're saying. So is there such thing as Islamic terrorism? Can that even exist? Islamic terrorism?
No, I mean, no chance. There's no such thing as Islamic terrorism. I mean, it's an oxymoron. Islam does not promote terrorism. But the reason they push that is that they want to create this, like I said, they create this view that Islam and terrorism is linked. So they will always use that kind of terminology. And then it puts Muslims on the back foot because it feels like, oh, this is Islamic. You know, if you call something Islamic, then it belongs to Muslims, doesn't it? Yeah. So if it's Islamic terrorism, okay, now this terrorism belongs to Muslims, right? So absolutely, that is the problem. That's what they do on purpose to push their propaganda against Islam and Muslims. So that's one thing, it pushes a narrative. The second thing, as you guys have highlighted, it helps their foreign policy. So the terrorism is used to invade lands. In fact, it actually is also used to continue to interfere in lands that they have apparently left. So they've left Afghanistan, right? They've left, yet they still drone strike Afghanistan. Why? Because ISIS-K, because terrorism still exists. So even though they've left a land, this term terror is such a term that can never go away. It's concept, isn't it? That whenever they want to, they'll launch something somewhere, and then they can invade and they can interfere in that land, and they did, right? And then the third thing is the domestic policy. So they will use these acts in these lands. It will happen like we had with the David Ames, that you had it in France, you have in London, loads of places happened where there's been local acts, what they call homegrown terrorism. Then they use this for like as a foreign policy, but also to promote the PREVENT scheme, CVE, counter-violent extremism. They want to force Muslims to integrate. So in France, you had all this thing about Macron talking about, what's it called, Islamic separatism, because they're saying that Muslims are separate. So what I'm trying to say is, backing up my point that they need terrorism because it allows them to push on three fronts that I've just mentioned, their political agenda.
Yeah, and even it's mad how with David Ames, we don't know what the real story is. It's gonna come out in the news, a bit more detail. You know how they are saying that this is a hate crime or act of terror, but just say this guy stabbed him and he was brainwashed or he had some wrong ideas, right? But how is that linked to terrorism, international terror, whilst you have foreign soldiers in lands where they're killing people point blank, they're cutting parts of the bodies off as trophies, right? But that's not labeled as terrorism. But here you got a guy who, did a awful act of killing an innocent man, okay? But it's linked to somehow global terrorism, even though they have not said that yet. But I'm sure they're going to find a tape or some sort of letter or something where he's going to, pledge allegiance to ISIS, right?
ISIS, yeah.
But you got to just think to yourself, is that why is it? And that's why it goes down to a brilliant point that you guys have said. And I want to sort of reinforce it for our listeners that we shouldn't be using their definitions, because if we do, then maybe we will start saying jihad is terrorism because it fits their sort of criteria. Why are we using their definitions for? In their definition, a guy who, can commit rape in a foreign land, kill people, take, cut off body parts like, his predator or something for trophies, right? And okay, maybe, a bad apple, but he's not a terrorist. But you got someone else who may have some mental issues, right? And does an act of madness, but then he's somehow linked to the West, the Western world, the freedoms of the West are in danger because of this one person. Come on, man. This is exactly what you said, bro. That if you could, and actually, that comment that you said about the lies, I think it's Donald Rumsfeld. He said something like, if you tell a lie that's like crazy enough, like, if you're gonna lie, go big time. Like, like there's mountains in the Tora Bora Mountains. There's proper bases inside with tanks and computers and all sorts. Right? If you're gonna lie, right, go big time because people will believe it. The more outrageous the lie, people will believe it, right? And it's just that's why it's important, like you said, that as Muslims, we need to use our own minds. We can't just fall into this trap. Because, like you said, JK, I think you were going to mention it, and I sort of asked you that question. That what we're getting is these sort of events, I think, are also designed to put Muslims on the back foot. To try to then feel somehow that Islam has got something to do with this. Maybe we will call for reforms. Maybe jihad is the problem. Maybe we want to, maybe we will be happy with the governments of Saudi Arabia who see certain ayats and certain surahs of the Quran being problematic in the modern times. Maybe we'll fall into that trap.
And that's the key danger, because when you think terrorism is a problem, if a Muslim thinks that, then you start to try to find ways to improve that and resolve that problem. But it's not a problem, because it's such a tiny minority, if you can even call it that where it happens, and people, there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. If we're all advocates of terrorism, the world would not have survived this long. So we know that. So there's no need to be defensive or apologist and any of that, right? But the key thing is, like you said, don't use their lexicon, don't use their language, but rather recognize what agenda is being played out. So even with this David MS killing, look, I don't know the background to it. Like Rashid, I can't really, I'm not bothered anymore, because it happens day in, day out. Currently, there's so many examples of it. So you get a bit fed up even looking into some of this stuff. But what I would say is, if you look at the kind of messaging after, they've really pushed that this is an attack on democracy, right? It's because he was an MP. So by killing an MP, obviously, it's basically kind of saying you're attacking democracy because he's an elected member of parliament, right? So what this does automatically is that anyone who is against this attack, which everyone is really, then you should also be in line with the messaging that it's an attack on democracy. But what about a Muslim that has I've got no loyalty to democracy, a man-made system that has caused much harm in the world, right? But at the same time, I don't support this act. But what they do is they put you in camps. So you're either with the terrorists or you're with them, right? And with them, it's just pushing for this narrative of we need to be countering violent extremism, preventing terrorism. We need to be calling for democracy, and this is an attack on democracy. But look, we Muslims, we need to have our own agenda, which is set by Allah and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's the way we need to look at it, very objectively and very, suspiciously, because these acts are not just, they're not. They've got reasoning behind. They push a certain agenda that we need to be aware of, like you said.
Part of this is linked to capitalism in itself, and you might be wondering how. So I think the issue is that under capitalism, the common person doesn't, he struggles. You get obviously, as the elite and the wealthy, they have more, and then the amount of people who are suffering in this society. And remember, this is Western world we're talking about as well. Like I mentioned, I think in the previous podcast, homelessness and poverty and all of these things are very rife in the Western world. And you would think this is supposed to be the rich part of the world, but actually there's much homelessness and difficulty here. So how do you get someone who is struggling to put food on the table to advocate and support foreign aggression, wars? it's very difficult, isn't it? Because if you think about it, if, for instance, if I'm in that category and the government's saying, I'm not going to give you an extra £20 in your benefits, I'd rather spend that £20 bombing Afghanistan or Iraq, at first I'm going to be like, no, I need that money to feed my children. However, if now an attack occurs somewhere close to me, my church, my mosque, my whatever, something that's close, that's where the localized terrorism fits a purpose, because it means that all of a sudden I'm willing to give up that £20 of my benefit in order for the government to use that to fight terrorism elsewhere, because I've seen it's close to home. If it was just happening across the border and constantly the battles were going over there, which it is happening as well, then it's easy for me to go, you know what, that's not my problem. You lot do what you want to do. I've got to worry about my children and my livelihood and food in my stomach. But this is why they need local terror attacks. And then, you know, because then all of a sudden it comes closer to home. I now have to think that, oh, what if my child goes to school and there's a terrorist attack there? I would rather give some of my income to this government so it can protect me and protect my children. So this is where the fact that capitalism doesn't provide for people, especially the masses, this is their way also of ensuring they can continue to carry out these wars. And we often know these wars, many of the elite are the ones that benefit from them. You know, you look at all of these, you know, arms companies. It's the arms companies that are making billions, if not trillions. You know, just last week we were talking about, you know, these Pandora Papers. Exactly. You know, who were making money in it, and who is putting this money away in these foreign lands and things like that? It's these people with ridiculous amounts of wealth that they're trying to hide it, or they don't want to pay taxes on them. Yeah. So this is where sometimes you might think, well, how do you link terrorism to capitalism? It's very much linked. And that's why they carry out some of these localized ones. And that's where I'm convinced that some of them are done by, you know, they're done where they groom people, or they find someone who's mentally unstable and then go, this is the person we're going to use or allow to do a particular act. And then we can push our policy and our agenda based on that person committing that crime.
Definitely. I mean, there's evidence of it. It's just brushed under the carpet.
Exactly.
I can remember a previous attack that happened where in the same time, another attack happened in another country. But the media attention was so much on this local attack because they were ready to push the narrative, because they're ready. They know it's going to happen. Or like I said, there's no need to go into the exact of whether they totally planned it out. Whether or not they planned it out, they exaggerate the impact. And that's the point. So you'd always see the same messaging that comes out. It's an attack on our values, attack on our democracy. You know, that's a test. If every time something like this happens, there'll be more, unfortunately. Look at the messaging of the politicians. They will always talk about an attack on our values and attack on our democracy, because they want to pit two groups. They want the group that's with them and the group that's with the terrorists. And even Bush said it himself when the war on terror was launched. You know, you're either with us or you're with them. There's only two camps, and that's the danger.
Like I mean, Russia's talking about the 20 pounds, and that's 100% correct. But I'd even say like there's even something greater than that, and that's the freedoms. So you remember when all the stuff that kicked off, and like all these airports and people with the water, the thing that the West prides itself on is its freedom. So, you know, for example, when they're talking about now they're considering having MPs being having security, this in a way is against their freedoms, because in a free society, the model is that MP should be able to walk around without any problem. They shouldn't need any surveillance, or they shouldn't need anyone protecting them. But what you're going to understand is now that for them to now remove the freedoms of the people, they need a reason for people to give away the freedoms. And initially it happened with these attacks, right? And then you had those guys who were carrying some fluids on the airplanes. And then if you guys know, if you actually flew out around those times, it was crazy. You know, you could take 100 ml of toothpaste and that sort of stuff, right? It was kind of crazy, right? But if you think about it, maybe there's another angle to this, because now what they're talking about is how when they talk about radicalization and they talk about, and I'm sure they're going to talk about it with this guy, if it goes down that route, is that this guy was brainwashed online, right? And it almost seems as if like they sense that Islam is reviving, the Muslims are getting closer to Islam, right? And now we're in a day of social media and the internet, and the more people are getting aware of what Islam is and what they want Islam to, to be, then that's going to get that voice and that message and that idea is going to get wide coverage because of social media and stuff, right? So it just so seems like even before, like, like when we talk about freedoms, like if somebody was to monitor your internet activity or stuff like this, is a no-go. In a free society, the government can't do that. It's not a police state, right? But you make the situation so bad in the mind anyway that people are willing to say, because I remember there were some guys at work where some guys were dead against it. Other guys were like, well, I ain't got nothing to worry about. I'm not going to do anything wrong. So that, you get some people are willing to do it for the security, whilst other people are a bit more ideological, like, nah, man, this is my freedom. Who the hell are they to do this, right? But when these attacks happen, what it does, it reminds people that, like JK said, it could happen at the school, it could happen to their kids, right? So let's give a little bit away and we get more security. Yeah. And in reality, what it becomes is a police state. I've had I mean, I don't know whether I should say this online or not, but I've had sort of police visit me, and it was bogus, this visit, because they came to see me. Actually, they were harassing me for a while, right? And it so happened that one day I was at home. And remember this, now this is the police now, right? There could be robberies, rapes going on, some real crime, right? And what the guy's issue was a Facebook post, which they couldn't remember what the content was. It was maybe about Afia Sadiq, not Afia Sadiq. It was maybe about, remember that sister that got caught in Syria, who wants to come back now?
Shamima Begum.
Shamima Begum. It was around that time. And I was like, if someone's got a problem with my Facebook post, shouldn't they be telling Facebook, why is the police coming around? Because it was so ridiculous. It was so ridiculous that, and I could have played about them in all honesty, right? But I need to go work, so I wanted the discussion to end quickly. But, you could have been like, are you kidding me? Are you being serious that you knocked on my door at 7 o'clock in the morning about a Facebook post whilst there's some real crime going on? But one thing I did say to the guy, exactly, Rash, once I said, you know what, this is like a police state. This is a thought police, right? So people can't have a different opinion now. But that's what I'm trying to say to you, that for them to get to that stage, if they do succeed, they need people to be scared. It's fair, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the biggest bogeyman now, and like I mentioned that quote before by the media, is that they've done it so many times now, deliberately, that they linked Muslims and Islam to terrorism or jihadism, and even the words they use, jihadism and so on, that now subconsciously it's if there's an attack, people will think it was there a Muslim involved. If there's a Muslim involved, he could have been a gangster, he could have been all sorts, you know what I mean? He could have been just going to, it could be a failed drug deal or something, right? But if they find out the guy's a Muslim, automatically people think it's terror attack.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Definitely.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think it's to scare people of Islam?
100%. And you just reminded me when you just said that point about social media. Really good point, because the other day I was listening to the radio just after this attack happened, the stabbing of the MP. And this other MP lady came on and she started talking about social media, and social media giants need to take a greater role. And I was thinking to myself, what's this got to do with social media? Like, it happened in person. So I genuinely was thinking, is she just trying, what's she talking about? Like, it's got nothing to do with social media. But it goes back to what you said, that actually if they push this narrative that he was radicalized online, and the social media giants do need to play a more active role. I mean, they're already, like you said, they're already stopping certain posts. They have all this. I don't know whether you know. There's a paper written called the Battle of Keywords, So depending on what word you use on social media, they have algorithms to either demonetize it, so it doesn't really reach anywhere, or they can obviously flag you, and then things like what you just mentioned can happen. So and the reason is that back in the days, the traditional media was very controlled. You had 5 channels, they could control what was said in the 5 channels. They had regulation, right? With social media, it's largely been initially unregulated. But as more and more of the population use that, and the traditional source of media and information is less used, they've understood that this causes a risk. So we need to regulate this and make sure that certain ideas are contained, so that their ideas and values and propaganda continues to be spewed, and anything of the truth is limited. And with the reasons you've just mentioned there, to really to push their values and create this propaganda against Islam.
Yeah, and I think also, as Muslims, our history can't just go back to as far as 9/11 or even when ISIS came on the scene. As Muslims, we need to know our deen, and we need to know our history. So when people talk about jihad, and we should do a podcast on jihad, because jihad is a mercy to mankind, and people might see that as controversial, but we'll save that for another time, right? But people are changing it, whether they say, I mean, I remember one guy telling me jihad has absolutely nothing to do with violence. I was like, yo, and this guy was meant to be a Maulana, right? It was shocking, right? But maybe he was just scared, right? I remember, you guys know the score. People would say the J word. They wouldn't even say the word jihad anymore. They would say the J word. But if we understood our deen, and we look at the hadith that talk about jihad fi sabilillah, what are we gonna stop using what the messenger told us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, over what these people are saying? No. If we know our history, and we look at times in our history where there were, when, for example, the Crusaders, when they took Jerusalem, you saw terrorism. They killed every single person in Jerusalem to the extent that when the Christians wrote home, they said that the blood of the Saracens was reaching our knees, right? Not our knees, the knees of the horses, right?
Yeah.
That's terrorism. When Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, when he took it, he let them go. This is the mercy of Islam, right? Then you had, when there was a famine in Ireland, and the Ottomans, they sent relief, or when the Jews were being persecuted in Spain and Europe, the Ottomans sent ships to bring them to the Muslim lands. If we understand our history, these are the examples we can use, right? And then we'll actually think, you know what? We don't need to be on the defense. If you want to know what terrorism is, and this is hypothetical because you can't do it because they don't exist anymore, but go and speak to the native Indians at the time. Go and speak to the Aborigines. Go and speak to the people, the Aztec people, the people of South America, right? Go and speak to the people in Africa. Go and speak to the people of DR Congo, right? Go and speak to these people. Go and speak to the people that were affected by the slave trade. Speak to these people, and they'll tell you what terrorism is. And if you don't want to go as far as that, go and visit Fallujah, where even now children are being born with defects because of the depleted uranium that was thrown on them. You understand? So as Muslims, if we don't take the time out and effort out to learn about our deen and our history, then we can't defend it. We can't defend it. And as Brother Muttaki said in one of the podcasts, one of the reasons why he even learned about Islamic history was because of the things that he realized he couldn't defend Islam because he didn't have the knowledge. You know what I mean?
The difficult thing is for us, and it's like, a lot of people, they don't look beyond the narrative. And this is why it's so difficult. Like you say, even well-educated people you work with, maybe got degrees, got good jobs, you'll notice from their general language and the way they behave around people and things that sometimes they probably know that if they dig a little bit deeper, that what the narrative is incorrect, and they're probably the same people who are going, oh, the government's rubbish, look at how they handled COVID, and look, I don't believe a word the government's saying. And then I ask these same people that you're constantly digging at the government about COVID and all of these things, do you ever not question the narrative against Islam? But they don't. Many of them don't. Many of them still just take that narrative, Islam and terrorism, they're synonymous. That's the attitude you get. And that's why JK's point, I think, is so key, that's why it's affecting Muslims as well. Is yes, I'm not saying it's not defeat. I'm not being defeatist, because like you said, we have the knowledge, we have the truth, we can explain this. We need to continue this mission of making people aware of this. But we're in a challenging time where, firstly, the non-Muslims, the people who just are taking the things at face value are not realizing this is what's happening behind the scenes, and then some Muslims are being affected by it. But that's not to say that the people who do dig a little bit deeper, they quite quickly come to the truth. You hear these political scientists. Who's that? Is it Dr. Miller or someone? The guy who was
Miller, who was
he was thrown out of which university was it? Bristol University.
Bristol University, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So he's not Muslim, but at least what he's doing, he's going, look, if you look at the situation in Israel, you can and Palestine, you can see who is the aggressor and who is being occupied. Just speaking the truth, what happens? Gets chucked out of university. Yeah. So people who want to be sincere and look into it and scratch below the surface, they immediately see that the media narrative, the Western narrative, is completely flawed and it's agenda driven. But our challenge really is that, we need to make sure we get out to those people who too easily just go, oh, you know what, whatever the news says, it says, and let's just get on with our lives and not do anything about it.
Yeah. I think the main reason for that is, like you said, when it comes to like some of these like COVID and all these other things, it impacts them directly. Right, so it's back to capitalism, back to benefit. When it impacts them directly, they have an opinion, they want to say something. But when it doesn't impact them, when it comes to Islam, when it comes to demonizing Islam, they just accept the narrative. And like you said, only when even non-Muslims, when they question the narrative, there's a reaction, there's a consequence that Dr. Miller had to face, even though he's not Muslim and he's just talking about the reality of Zionism.
Exactly. Another quick point just to make is that, like, for instance, when you start talking about state-sponsored terrorism, maybe Madge is probably something you want to discuss anyway.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we need to talk about that, because like JK said right at the beginning, how they've made terrorism about an individual lone wolf or about a particular group that they've gone, we're going to now identify this group as a terrorist group, as if it's just up to them to decide who is and who isn't, and all of this rubbish. But what the issue people should immediately ask is it's the state-sponsored attacks on innocents, which is the real terrorism. There's some stats that some PhD graduate did, this was a number of years ago, that secular wars post, all of the battles, the Crusades and all of these things, secular wars have killed more than 87 million people.
Wow.
87 million people in secular, in wars with political genders. Okay, sometimes people will try and link them to a religion somehow, but many of these wars were nothing to do with religion. They were about, borders and, dominance and democracy and all of these things that are not related to religion. And this is how many people have been killed in the 21st century. Much more than some of these religious so-called wars and stuff of the past. So it's state-sponsored terrorism, which is the real terrorism. And states continue to do this. And these kind of individual cases are just ways to dupe the masses. And one just good example of this is, look, they always talk about Wahhabist, Salafist, jihadists sponsored by Saudi Arabia, don't they? Yeah. So if you're so annoyed at Saudi Arabia and you blame, you say that the 9/11 bombers came from Saudi, and you're talking about the Salafist ideology comes from Saudi Arabia, why is it that you support Saudi Arabia ahead of every other Muslim country in the world? Isn't that ironic? So maybe people should question the narrative and go, wait there a minute, you lot moan about this type of Islam, so-called, and yet you are sponsoring and supporting the main exporters of it, again, so-called.
Yeah.
It's, come on,
But
people, really
Rash,
scratch below the surface.
even if just say you talk about state terrorism, now just say these guys go over, they indiscriminately bomb, kill loads of innocents, right? Innocent people, and there's someone who has lost his entire family, 3 generations, because in Muslim lands they sort of live together, don't they, right? Now just say this guy was to retaliate, as an example, right?
Exactly.
It's, if you think about it, even actually, I'll give you an example where someone was directly involved. Even the attacks that they are saying, which are like terrorist attacks, maybe by like this Somali guy who's like meant to be a British citizen, all of it is linked, even if it's like not, whether it's right or wrong or whether it's actually real or not, but all of it is linked to foreign policy.
Why didn't? Yeah, exactly. Why was it not happening prior to the Iraq War?
Why was it not happening before?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And that's the point. That's the point, that if you're going to go over and destroy and kill people, like in Iraq now, for example, man, there's no clean water, there's electricity shortages, and lives are like ruined, and no one's going to be a bit angry at that.
Yeah, you're talking about the people who love making movies about some guy whose wife or kid got killed, by someone, and all of a sudden he goes out and wipes out, commando style. Yeah, exactly. So you're making movies about this kind of stuff, yet when someone does it, terrorism.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's true, man. It's true, and state-sponsored terrorism, like I said, I think if I'm gonna sort of join the dots that you guys have sort of put together, I would say, like, from the first point, what sort of JK said, to the final point that you said about state terrorism, bro, is I would say is that what you can see is that when these actual states are the ones that are defining what terrorism is, right, then the terrorists will always be the people that they are against. And even though they will commit atrocities, right, whether it's, keep saying whether it's, there's so many examples, like even in 1991 when the Iraqi military was coming back from Kuwait, it was surrendered, right? They killed those people, right, indiscriminately, and there were families that were, because when the Iraqi soldiers went over, it wasn't just military, the families went over, right?
Yeah.
Same thing happened in Afghanistan. There's another road or something where the Americans were bombing. So the thing is when you define what terrorism is, and then what you can see is that, and as Malcolm X said, isn't it? If you're not careful, and if you believe the papers, you'll believe that the oppressor is oppressed. You understand? Yeah. And the oppressed are the oppressors. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly how you're seeing it today. And that's why I think, as Muslims, and why I think this topic is really interesting from a Muslim point of view, is not to, be afraid, not to get pressurized into, giving up our principles, giving up our, culture, purely under this intense bombardment. It's not easy. It's not easy at all, and especially if you don't have the tools. It's not easy, but we just need to use a bit of intellect and a bit of effort, because, as Rash said, people out there are so intelligent. Muslims, they are doctors, they are like scientists. In all of the other fields, they don't leave a stone or rock unturned, as they would say, right? When it comes to the deen, why is it like there's not that same effort?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, guys, inshallah, this has been really, really interesting. I think we can probably do a wrap once I get your final thoughts, really, if there is any, because I think it's really good how I think we've gone through this topic, and hopefully for the listeners, they can see that when we talk about terrorism and terrorists, these definitions are bogus and they are subjective, and they will be used by people. But as Muslims, we have our own criteria, and we need to follow that, and that's the haqq. And we don't deceive people. it is what it is. It's very clear in Islam. But Rash, bro, any final comments from yourself?
Not really comments as such. All I will say is I think your idea from before was excellent. I think we should do that. So it's a bit of a plug. I think this topic naturally leads into the fact that, Islam recognizes that human beings clash and there will naturally be conflict as a human species. And then Islam has defined a way of carrying out that clash in a way where innocent people aren't killed, in a way there's rules of engagement in Islam. And it links to your topic that you said we should cover the topic of jihad sometime in the future, because I think then we will see, anybody who doesn't know will see that when you cover that topic, you can compare immediately to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined how engagement, rules of engagement and conflict should occur, making sure the most vulnerable are protected in the process, versus what we have seen in the 21st century and those numbers that I gave earlier, and how indiscriminate killing of innocents has owned innocent people have come from secular minded and people who don't follow the truth. So I think it's just a plug really I think it's an excellent idea to do that topic in future.
Yeah, wicked, bro. Before I come to you, JK, just a thought that's come to my mind. What Rash is saying, inshallah, I think we'll definitely do that soon, and maybe there's something which we can probably discuss and look further into is what's that illness that people get when they come back from wars today?
Post-traumatic stress
PTSD, isn't it?
Yeah.
It'd be good if we did research to see if PTSD was a problem in the old days when in reality there was probably more chance of you getting it because it was hand-to-hand combat. You were looking in the eyes of the person you were killing, right? But now a lot of people are getting it. Why? Probably because they're killing innocent people and they know they're killing innocent people. Whilst when you're on the battlefield, you fight, if you don't kill him, he's killing you. Maybe that's another extra plug there. But
6 point.
JK, what are you saying, bro? Any final thoughts, bro?
Yeah, no, to be fair, I agree with what both you said. And just linked to that, I heard a quote, I can't remember who said it, but it's a really profound quote that every war is injustice, is zulm, it's oppression, except for a war for the sake of Allah. Every single war is done for another reason, for money, for power, for agenda of men, agenda of states. But except for jihad fi sabilillah, because you're doing it for the sake of Allah. And even Allah in the Quran, when he refers to fi sabilillah, in the cause of Allah, it's in reference to jihad, I want to say almost every single time. So again, that's a plug for a future discussion, but just linked to that, I think my point was going to be that, as you said, Maj, that it's really important for Muslims to regain that confidence. We don't have that confidence in Islam. And the way we do that practically is to understand these concepts that are being attacked. So again, linked to what Rash is saying, that doing a topic on jihad will be brilliant because it will reinforce the positive message of jihad, the fact that it is a mercy to mankind. But not just that, in every other thing, that what we're being accused of, the only way that we can move it away and bat it away is by having the true understanding of Islam, because Islam is haq and has the answers to these. We don't need to lose confidence or feel defensive or apologist in that. And we have our own values. So all these things they're pushing down our throat, all this liberalism, we have to accept and have respect towards. But when it comes to our values, when it comes to our deen, when it comes to our flag, we there's no, they don't need to respect that. So we need to gain that confidence back, and we can only do that through knowledge. So inshallah, that's kind of my advice to listeners, to myself, to make sure that we don't fall in the trap of being defeatist and feeling like we have to defend Islam. We don't. Islam is the truth, and we have the knowledge to be able to kind of defend that.
Sound advice, bro. Sound advice, man. Mashallah, has been a great podcast, and hopefully I'll benefit from it, and I'm sure the listeners and those watching it on YouTube will benefit from it as well. On that note, just to remind everyone that the Islamic Vibes podcast is available on all popular podcast platforms and also on YouTube under the channel name of Path to Revival. If you found this beneficial, then please share it with your family and friends. Brothers, Jazakallah khair really for short notice coming on. It's a pleasure. as usual. And I think we plugged the jihad once in so much. We definitely need to do that next, right? So let's start planning, inshallah ta'ala, yeah. But yeah, jazakallah guys, and inshallah ta'ala, as usual, I will see you guys on the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.